It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Jefferson Cowie for several reasons. One, to congratulate him on winning the Pulitzer Prize for History 2023. This is indeed. Freedom's Dominion is a remarkable book, and from a personal standpoint, he has expanded by 100% my list of recommendations of must-read books for anyone wanting to know about Alabama. My longtime number one, Stars Fell in Alabama, was a bestseller in 1934. And its guiding conceit was that Alabama, its folkways, its politics, its customs, its religion are so different from the rest of the United States that it is, in effect, a foreign country lodged within our national borders. Senator Katie Britt, I think, is showing you how you hold on to that kind of distinction. Freedom's Dominion is really, as I say, it's expanded my list by 100%. And I can't tell you how pleased I am. I have to, before I get Jeff started on the questions I have for him, I want to tell you how he brought my memories back to a January day in 1963, when, as a college student, I heard George Wallace deliver his Segregation Forever speech. And I knew that we were in for a long nightmare in Alabama. And I want to read you what Jeff wrote because I think it is so eloquent. I had the honor of writing Wallace's obit in the New York Times, and I said that he came from a sun-blasted, rebel-haunted stretch of Alabama, and this man captured it perfectly. January 14, 1963 was the coldest day in almost any Alabamian's lifetime, and the governor's breath rose into the winter air. The man who would go on to become the firebrand of the modern conservative movement seemed to breathe history and exude ghosts. And there's never been a better description of Barber County, Alabama. So Jefferson, I wanted to start by asking you, a Californian by birth, I believe, or by undergraduate education.
That is correct.
How you settled on Barber County, Alabama.
Well, first let me say what an honor it is to be here with you. The first introduction to the civil rights movement I had intellectually was as a college student in the 1980s when I was assigned My Soul is Rested.
Thank you.
And it came to fruition a number of years later. For me, so thank you for that. So the book opens with that famous speech where George Wallace, governor of Alabama, is giving his inaugural, and he says, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. And this is in every textbook in American history. But if you look at this speech closely, he mentions segregation a total of 4 times. Those 3 times and one other. He mentions freedom 24 times. And the essence of the speech, which was actually written by a Klansman, Ace Carter, is freedom in some version. And I think it is up to us, and this was my task, is to make sense of this idea of freedom. What does he mean, and what does the long history of talking about freedom in this one place tell us about this American creed, this core belief that we all share but have very fractured meanings of? And through a sort of deep dive in the history of the idea of freedom, I began to untangle this idea of the freedom to dominate, the freedom to control others, the freedom to control others politically, the freedom to control their land, the freedom to control their labor. And this was a kind of product of a long search for trying to understand why my version of freedom wasn't somebody else's version of freedom, and why some people's version of freedom downright scared me. And so I found it all right there in that iconic moment in January 1963.
when I first saw this book, the title Freedom's Dominion shocked me because I knew Barber County's history pretty intimately as an Alabamian. But I think, the Pulitzer Committee was right in saying that Jefferson Cowie has redefined what we mean by freedom. And I'd like to invite you, Jeff, to dilate a bit more on freedom to dominate, because that is the core concept of the book.
Right. So I go back to this historical sociologist named Orlando Patterson, who's at Harvard, and he did a whole history of the Western idea of freedom, and dialing all the way back to Athenian democracy makes the important point that the idea of freedom is born in a slave society. That the place where freedom and democracy are born is a slave society. And we have to make sense of that. And so freedom was not just to not be a slave, but it was also the capacity to enslave. And if you open that sort of trap door in this question, you go into a very rich world in which we understand freedom to be a very different thing. And then if you take, and he says basically it's mixed with other versions of freedom, civil liberties, the ability to participate in your political community, but it's really that freedom to dominate, what he calls sovereignal freedom, the freedom to enslave, the freedom to take other people's land, that I really focus on. And the next step is to take that idea of freedom, that freedom to dominate, and then if you put it in the Deep South, you're putting it in a rare combination in global history, which is a settler colonial society, that is a place where people take over the land of other people, and a chattel slave society. And if you put those two things together and combine it with this ideology of freedom, you have a very virulent, combustible concept of the American creed.
This is a lightning bolt concept in Southern history, I think, and we see it today in Alabama, my native state. The idea of freedom as the ability to dominate other segments of society, be they minorities, women, and that I think is an invigorating idea of this book, and it's something that we need to hold on to. Now, I want to take Jeff now to the freedom to dominate has to do with the origin story of Barber County, Alabama. And this is where, again, his book is a great leap in historiography. So let's go to the origin story, Jeff.
And this gets us to the other piece of the title and the puzzle, which is federal power. So the freedom to dominate, as I've defined it, is challenged. It's essentially works best on the local level and is challenged occasionally, inefficiently, in a very checkered way by the federal government throughout the history of this place and a lot of places. So the story opens in which this 9-county region on the edge of the Chattahoochee River is the Creek Nation. It's been set aside for the Creek people in eastern Alabama. Well, as soon as the treaty is signed, white intruders flood in to this area, especially Eufaula, the main city in Barber County. And then a very, very strange thing happens. Andrew Jackson, the guy who, known for being an Indian killer, pro-slavery, opening up, well, I don't need to lecture anybody in New Orleans about Old Hickory, but he actually sends troops in to Barber County to remove white settlers from Muskogee Creek lands. And so what happens is this white settlement is born defending its freedom to steal land from the Indians from the federal authorities that are coming in. And in fact, the troops burn the main buildings that the white people have built in the settlement, and they drag them back over the river to Georgia, where all the rascals live. And so the very birth of this place is a tension between local freedom to take land, federal authority to stop them. And that's why the saga of white resistance to federal authority is the subtitle of the book. That a sort of white version of freedom emerges, fighting federal power that comes in inefficiently, I would say, and tries to defend to a certain extent indigenous, later freedmen, later black citizens' rights. And it's a dynamic story in which you're sort of looking at what level citizenship happens for people. And my argument is basically the white elite are trying to keep their freedom and their citizenship on the local level, and the Indians and the African Americans are trying to project their citizenship up to the federal level, where they'll get more protection, and that's the rub.
I want you to appreciate what a deep dive we're getting into Alabama history here. My book, Silent Cavalry, represents 6 decades of study about Alabama, where I was born in 1943. It became my obsessive concern as a young person, and it's the reason I became a journalist, trying to understand this. And so when I tell you this is a deep dive, I know whereof I speak. And I want to go back now to Andrew Jackson. My book is about the anti-secession movement in North Alabama, started in 1861 by people who called themselves Jacksonian Democrats. So Jeff, square that circle of Andrew Jackson, if you will, how he's one thing in Winston County and another thing in Barber County.
It's amazing the north part of the state is the same state, really. I mean, that's the first thing I learned. I'm not a Southern historian. I am not a historian of Alabama. I'm not from there. I started this with a question of freedom, and I was looking for some way to tell that story. And I stumbled across worlds of expertise that are beyond comprehension about Southern history. But this idea of Jackson, on the one hand, the colonizer of the entire Southeast, the white man's president, the expander of slavery, is in this case actually defending minority rights. I shouldn't even say minority, they're majority in the Creek Nation. And so this drives local people in Alabama, local white people, to the brink of secession in the 1830s. And in fact, the federal government draws up plans to subdue Alabama in the 1830s because they're afraid they're going to leave the Union over this intruders war and whether white people can steal the land set aside for the Muskogee Creek people. So so Jackson takes a very firm stand, as he did with John C. Calhoun and others, and said, no, we're going to defend these rights for a while. And then he caved, using the figure of Francis Scott Key, believe it or not, the author of the Star Spangled Banner, to go out there and kind of make this whole thing go away.
Well, I want to intervene here with my moderator's privilege by making the point that the reason we're in so much trouble in America today is not really Alabama, it's South Carolina. John C. Calhoun emerges, turns on President Andrew Jackson while Calhoun is vice president, I believe, and starts talking about the South leaving the Union in 1840. This is 20 years before the Civil War really becomes a critical issue. And Jackson famously said in a public meeting, as I believe, the Union, sir, it must be preserved. And so the positive side of that, before Jackson went into some other adventures, including genocide, was to inspire the North Alabamians to think of themselves as Unionists and to believe, as a matter of political conviction, and this demonstrates the difference between the political ethos of North Alabama, the mountain place that owned very few slaves, and the Black Belt, which this vast industrial complex based on free labor. These mountain people believed with Jackson that the Union was too sacred to be torn apart over the issue of slavery. So that's my Alabama commercial. I'll try not to do that anymore.
Let me interject.
Yeah, please.
On that. We're spending a lot of time talking about Alabama, and like we can dive deep. But Wallace himself, we may have buried the lead, which is George Wallace is from
Not
Barber
the first
County.
time I've done that.
I thought you were a trained professional.
That's right.
Is that George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, and the man who ran for president in 64, 68, 72, and 76, is from Barber County. So that's why we're talking about George Wallace. But he saw this not as just a Barber County thing or an Alabama thing, but even in that speech that we started talking about, he cast a national vision for a Southern version of freedom, and he thought it would resonate nationally. So, this isn't just a sort of exercise in regional history, but there are problems with the sort of creed of freedom nationally, not just in the Deep South.
Yeah. While you're on that point, Jeff, let me invite you to discuss further something you and I touched earlier, which is the political descendants of George Wallace's idea of this peculiar idea of freedom as it played out in presidential politics.
You mean subsequently?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, when Wallace was near death and he was trying to make sense of his life, he sat back and said, Clinton, Reagan, those guys, they're just doing what I said. I had it figured out way before those guys. And so not only is this sort of anti-statist version of freedom that Wallace mined at work, but Wallace also played this fundamental role in rejiggering the political parties. He remained a Democrat throughout his life, but as Kevin Phillips, Nixon's famous strategist, said, the Wallace voters were moving between a Democratic past and a Republican future.
Yeah. I would interject Reagan, Nixon, of course, with the Southern strategy, civilized to some extent the Wallace playbook. But don't forget that Reagan in 1980 went to Neshoba County, Mississippi, and spoke about states' rights within a few miles of the graves of the three civil rights workers who were killed there in 1964. So this shows you, to me, Freedom's Dominion shows us how these political pathologies radiate into the future. And I wanted to take you not briefly, as long as you want to spend it, to your second.
You don't want to go that long.
The third section of your book is called Federal Power in Repose. So what do you mean? Talk some about what happened there and what the implications of that are.
So the book is divided into three sections. The first one is the Indian removal, which is a very clinical term for genocide, as you put it. The second one is about Civil War and Reconstruction, and the third one is this federal power in repose. The fourth is the modern civil rights era. And what the federal power in repose follows possibly the most dramatic chapters in the book, which is the collapse of Reconstruction. Because what had happened literally at sort of bayonet point in many counties throughout the South was the enforcement of the aggressive enforcement of a biracial democracy. And it worked. We've talked a lot about the lost cause, this myth that Reconstruction was a complete failure and never should be tried again, and black people didn't could handle rights. Well, in fact, what happened was the only time in the history of this region of the state a black person was elected to the Congress. Didn't happen before, and it hasn't happened since. And this came to an end in 1874 when black voters had come into town from the north and the south and were essentially shot in the street, at least through a hail of gunfire. The white elite largely mowed down at least 80, possibly twice as many of that voters. And this ended Reconstruction in Barber County, and the federal troops pull out of the South almost completely by 1877. And I call this the era of the federal government in repose. And this is in the absence of federal power. So this is sort of the test case of, in some ways, what it means if the federal government's not there. We see some of the most heinous aspects of race relations in America. We see convict leasing, in which convicts from counties throughout the South are sent into the mines up by Birmingham in some of the worst labor conditions anybody has ever devised, possibly, certainly in the modern age. It includes the era of lynching. I have a chapter that was very difficult to write called Lynching is an Act of Freedom. The idea being that to be able to take somebody's life with impunity is a certain kind of freedom that is deeply ingrained in American history. The rise of the segregationist constitution, the Jim Crow Constitution, in the case of Alabama in 1901. So all these sort of really dark parts of the American racial past really erupt most effectively during this period where the federal government basically retreats.
So another of Jeff's expertise has to do with FDR and his great book about the FDR's New Deal programs. And if you would, Jeff, take us back. You were talking about the Compromise of 1876, which ended Reconstruction. What were the implications of that for the political coalition that FDR put together in the New Deal?
Right. So the hidden history of the whole entire Democratic Party up until the 1960s is that it's based on the white South, and and I think the Democratic Party has been struggling with the fact that it has not been able to rely on that. We begin to see that fall apart with the Dixiecrat Revolt in '48 and other moments. But I'm a little obsessed, actually, with the fact that the success of the Democratic Party, even under the heyday of Roosevelt, depended upon segregation, depended upon the white Democratic South. And Roosevelt wouldn't touch, say, anti-lynching legislation, because if he did, he was going to lose the white South, and then he was going to lose labor law and fair labor standards and Social Security and all the other stuff that he really wanted. So that it became kind of a untouchable area for him politically.
Yeah, and it was essential. The votes of Southern Congress members, mostly I think maybe all male at that time, was essential to passing the New Deal legislation in the first 100 days. And so this was the Faustian bargain that has haunted Roosevelt scholars ever since, but it is the reality that without Alabama, Mississippi, et cetera, the New Deal social agenda could not have been passed. So the Faustian bargain here was the Democratic Party saying to white Southerners, we're going to bring you back into the Union in every respect, except when it comes to black people, we will let, by local option, give you the freedom to dominate in an unconstitutional environment. So, Jeff, I'd like for you to go down that linkage between what the Barber County example, George Wallace, tells us about the modern struggle for civil rights.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the pattern throughout the book is really this question of what I borrow Madison's phrase, the compound republic, or what more of us might know as the problem of federalism. Where do rights exist? Local level, state level, federal level. And Madison hoped this whole thing would kind of work smoothly without any problems, and that was how you could govern a big republic. Well, in fact, I think the core history of the core theme in American history is really the constant clash and grinding of gears between federal and local, and we see that all the way up to now. in which one of the stunts I do in my classes, I say, how do you know you have the right to vote? Where is that guaranteed? And they're like, the Constitution, the Voting Rights Act, no, it's on the state level, right? That's a state thing. And there's a scene in the book, actually, it's one of my favorite scenes in the book, where George Wallace meets with Lyndon Johnson. And Lyndon Johnson says, would you just get off the segregation thing and, go build some old folks' homes and some nice highways? and he said, and then he says, let black people vote. And actually, he uses the worst term, Lyndon Johnson. And George Wallace says, I can't do that. That's totally up to the local registrars. I have no power. And Johnson leans over in his way. Wallace is short. He's like 5'6", 5'7". Johnson's huge. He leans over Johnson. He says, "Don't you shit me, George Wallace," because Wallace had managed to keep Johnson's name off the ballot in '64. So this goes right up to our present day of how this ridiculous voting system we have is kind of all jerry-rigged and inefficient. And so one of the, actually they kept Truman off too, and Lincoln off the ballot. Yeah, so.
In Alabama.
In Alabama, yeah, right, and other states. So ultimately the idea of this is we can debate everything. But my argument in this is the one thing the federal government should be doing is ensuring voting rights. And it's ultimately an argument for, I think, a constitutional amendment in favor that guarantees the right to vote to all people, regardless of anything besides citizenship.
This is a perfect illustration of another of Jeff's real turns of phrase about the compound republic. He said you've got these two sets of gears that often grind against each other, right? Which I think is very important. Speaking of deep dives, now we're going to come up to what this story has to tell us about where we are in America today with the Trump nomination now assured.
Okay, that's a wide open field. I promise you I'll get right on that, but the previous story reminded me of kind of the moment that I understood the problem of voting in the United States. And that was, so in 1965, after the Voting Rights Act is passed, Martin Luther King and SNCC and other groups sent out all these organizers to register people to vote throughout the Deep South. And at the end of the day, they were trying to make sense of why some counties had really good results and some other counties had bad results. And there was no correlations you could come up with, whether it was SNCC or SCLC was organizing, or whether it was charismatic leaders or well-behaved counties. Finally, they figured it out. And the success or failure of the right to vote in each county had to do with exactly one thing, and that's whether there was a federal registrar on the ground in that county to defend the voting rights of local people. Because it was that federal registrar that was fighting against George Wallace's version of freedom at that very same time, where he's saying, no, freedom is local, and those nasty federal bayonets on the hillside that are threatening to come down and take your rights are the threat that mobilizes my politics. And the more I was reading about Wallace, the more I was reading about Trump. I mean, one of the problems we have as historians, I think, is being overly presentist sometimes. Yeah. And we have to be careful, right? But the interesting thing about Wallace is how he constantly failed forward. Every time he did something, he lost. He lost everything. All his fights against the federal government. But he won every political race. Because when he would lose his fights with the federal government, it just proved how important he was as a fighter against the federal government. And I think we see a little bit about that with the current, what did Biden call him, his predecessor in the State of the Union? And that we see this kind of populist rage around around race and federal authority and this idea of freedom that is central to how we think about ourselves as a people. And the great thing about freedom, mobilizing around freedom, I think Trump said that freedom cleanses the soul in a State of the Union address. And the Freedom Caucus. So, for instance, if you buy my argument, and you don't have to, we see that the Freedom Caucus is actually an accurate term. It's not a group of people stealing a term, the Freedom Caucus being the far right wing of the congressional delegation. It's not just window covering. It's not just using a popular American term to cover your tracks or to offer window dressing. It is actually the way freedom has worked in a lot of these places. So the fact that this becomes a rallying cry for contemporary politics, and I think it's so powerful, this sort of mix of authoritarianism and freedom. My sort of scary line on this is that if fascism ever comes to America, it will march under the banner of freedom.
Yeah, and you do a good job in the book of illustrating how Wallace was able to use these ritual references to freedom 20 times or so in the speech, his inaugural address, as a way to introduce race as a central concern without using racist language, right?
Right. If you're racist, if you're just using racist language, you're going to get the racists. If you're talking, I hate the federal government, and your freedom will be with me, oppose the federal government, now you're getting anti-tax types, people who want deregulation, people who are not concerned about housing integration, all sorts of people. And now you have a coalition. And that is Wallace's flash of insight.
And back to Barber County, I don't want to wander too far, because to me the brilliance of this book is it shows you how Barber County was the nexus of so much political pathology that flowed out. Let's go back to, you want to talk a bit about the Eufaula Regency and how it played out in Alabama politics?
Yeah, so this Eufaula is the main town in Barber County, and this is down in the southeast corner of the state. And we may not have set this up we're two history nerds jumping in too deep too fast, but and so the Regency are the so-called fire eaters, the ones who are just itching to get in the Civil War and secede from the Union. But they're actually pretty clever in that they're good organizers, in the sense they're working it slowly. They're making sure they're not just trying to jump off a cliff. But when it comes time to secede from the Union, the Barber County petition to leave the Union says, and this is an appeal of slave owners to other slave owners and other whites, do you want to be subjugated like slaves? Do you want to be victims of tyranny like slaves? These are slaveholders using the slave metaphor to fight for their own freedom. And that's how they framed the Civil War. Yeah. It was a freedom fight for them.
And the Eufaula Regency represented the Black Belt plantation owners principally. After Reconstruction, they realized that the one thing that they needed, in addition to their control of land and resources in Alabama that was not interrupted by the war, was Northern capital. And that's when you get the New South doctrine of Henry Grady coming in, and you get this satanic coalition between the big landowners in the South and the extractive industries financed by Wall Street, hence Birmingham. Now, I know some of you have questions, and I want to leave time for that. So let's see.
I actually can't read the clock.
We got about 10 minutes. Is that right? Yeah. So come on up, please.
Hi. Thank you so much. I'm curious. Your background as a labor historian, partially, and how that influenced this book, particularly kind of in conversation with Robin Kelly, Alabama Communist Party, and more interracial organizing and unionism in Alabama. Like, what's the intersection there?
Great question. So the question is somebody who's actually read other books that I read, to which I'm very grateful. The bulk of my career has been as a labor historian and sort of understanding how class works in America and how class works in politics or doesn't. And one quick irony on that is when I started studying Barber County, I didn't know George Wallace was from Barber County. I just kind of discovered it accidentally, and I discovered Barber County accidentally. And then about 6 months later, I was like, oh my goodness, because so much of my life has been about the kind of George Wallace populist, white working class backlash politics. And so this, in some ways, is the deepest of dives into some of the issues that motivated Staying Alive. But it was also an admission in some ways that the question of class and class solidarity in America is deeply limited, truncated, fissured, choose your word, by the question of race. And that I saw the more I dealt with this, and I came to this very kind of fresh eyes, I'm not a Southern historian, that I began to realize how saturated some of our core ideas and institutions were in the development of those ideas from the get-go with the questions of race. So in some ways, it's a bit of a flip on that. In terms of Robin Kelly, he wrote a famous book called Hammer and Hoe about the left and mostly in and around Birmingham, but not just. And we've already hinted a little bit about this, but Alabama is a place of regions. And we are, in Barber County, we are deep into the Black Belt area that is essentially, it's kind of bifurcated actually between the wiregrass and cotton, but cotton rules. And that it was a long way away from the types of stuff that Robin was talking about in that book. But I would say what's really important for understanding both the development of labor and the development of the state in Birmingham, which is a steel-producing area, is that convict labor, convict leasing, essentially helped weaken organized labor in that area.
That's right. And connectivity is one of my passions in history, and it's one of the things that drew me to Jeff's book. I said, he figured it out. He found Barber County. I didn't realize what a long shot it was.
It was a total long shot.
It found him, and I want to. I was going on to a point about Birmingham and modern times, but I don't want to veer too far away. Well, I actually want to tempt you. Oh no, we've got another question. Good.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
No. I don't think you're on.
My name's Arthur. I'm a grad student here at Tulane, and 2 weeks ago I was assigned to read your "Is Freedom White" article.
I've heard about this.
Yeah. And I've reread it, and I've since bought your book and read the first chapter, so I feel better about it. But and I wish it was 30 pages because I wish that it was a little surface level for me when I read it the first time. But I'm so sorry. You compare him to you compare George Wallace to Barry Goldwater, and I wanted to ask you, studying past ideologies and how it reflects currently on modern conservatism, whose legacy do you think is more present right now? If it's not one of those two, who is it? But I know that you quoted his biographer as being, his biographer said that Wallace was the invisible founding father of modern conservatism. So where do you draw that line? Who's more alive right now?
I love that question, and let's talk later about the nature of the book. There's nothing better than a grad seminar. It's just like spleens being vented all over the place. So little known fact, George Wallace sent an emissary out to San Francisco in '64 to try to get himself nominated to be Goldwater's vice presidential candidate. And when I talk about that, I develop what I call the idea of the double helix of American conservatism. And the double helix of American conservatism consists of Barry Goldwater, who is, I think you could make the case, a principled conservative. I mean, he doesn't, he may believe in the rights of black people, but he's not going to support the Civil Rights Act or the Voting Rights Act. We could debate that, but for my purposes, it doesn't matter. But that's a sort of free enterprise, anti-statist coil. But nobody really cares about that except the economic elite, because they want low taxes and things like that. There's nothing to get the rubber to meet the road for Goldwater. In fact, he only wins the Deep South because of his opposition in Arizona, because of his opposition to the Civil Rights Act. The other helix is Wallace. And that's a populist, anti-statist, race-based kind of anti-statist ideology. And you put those together, and that's how you get a dynamic conservative movement. You need both sides, I think, of that story. And right now, to bring it back to Howell's question about contemporary politics, I think the principled version is breaking apart. And a lot of people are not sure where they're going with that side. But the populist version is quite robust. But if my theory is right, it shouldn't be able to stand only on its populist race-based strand either, I hope.
Another question?
This will be a great closer for you. So I love being here. I haven't read your book. I'm so excited. But I'm also so frightened and so pissed off. So I want to take your opinion.
You don't want to talk to me.
Well, I want your opinion moving forward, because what's really become, is how white supremacy has been normalized, and I hear it
Yes.
over and over again in every lecture I've attended.
Right.
So moving forward,
Right.
I mean, I woke up this morning and go, how did this happen? I am a child of the 60s, so how did this happen? And I don't need to know how it happened, but yeah, thank you. You're moving forward.
Right. Yes, moving forward. So one of the reasons I emphasize my idea is we need to move away from freedom. Freedom is a secessionist idea. Freedom is the ability to leave, to get out. You don't like it, you get in your truck and you drive away. Democracy. Let's put the focus on democracy. Democracy requires institutions. It requires compromise. It requires being in the same room with people you don't like. And it requires, I really can't emphasize institutions enough and how important they are in this. And I'm naive enough to believe that if the right to vote actually existed in a robust, uniform, and enforced ways without any petty restrictions with regard to, your conviction record or gerrymandering or how many places you have to vote, if it actually worked, I don't think we would have nearly the problems that we have now. And if the majority is actually, I realize this is going to sound, I hope this is both a little naive and a little refreshing, in the sense that if the system were allowed to work, I think it would work. So my project is to really get us to begin to think about voting and cleaning up this mess that is built around this kind of jerry-rigged system from the get-go, including the Electoral College, which, of course, Democrats have won every race since the 90s, except for 2004 in terms of the majority vote for president. But it's the Electoral College that is the problem. So that's, for me, the struggle. One footnote on white supremacy. I don't use that phrase except in a precise way because it wasn't really used by people except when they were advocating for white supremacy, mostly in that federal government and repose period at the beginning of the 20th century. Because I think it's way more dynamic than that. Like, I think it's more fluid and more interesting in a lot of ways.
So we're out of time. My coach here tells me this. I just want to say, Fitzgerald once used the English major stepping in here, once used the metaphor of the golden bowl being broken. And I think that's where we are in American democracy today. And if you want to know where the first crack appeared in the golden bowl, this is the book.
Thanks for coming out.
Thank you so much.